Welcome to the extra practice video for sketching parabolas. This was the homework assignment after day 8, which is the day where we learned quadratic formula. And in this homework assignment, what we're going to do is basically connect what we just learned about finding the roots of a quadratic function like this one. And we're going to connect that to what we did last week, where we were analyzing the graph of a quadratic equation. And we analyzed the graph by looking at things like the vertex and the roots and the range. On the quiz that you'll take next week, sketching the graph could be the kind of instructions that you get. It's a pretty general set of instructions. And what you need to know is that the graph basically has to do with two key things, the vertex and the roots. And in order to find these two key things, which is 1 point here and 2 points for this one, we need to use this information in two different ways. So I'll start with the vertex. And you probably remember that the vertex is a point, and it's a point that we usually give a name to. We call it h and k, where h just represents the x value of this point. And that, hopefully, just by writing that down, if you were to do this on the quiz, it would kind of jog your memory. Because we know how to find the vertex. There's a formula for it. And the formula uses these three numbers, which we call a, b, and c, in order to find h and then to find k. We start with h, and the formula I'm referring to is the formula negative b over 2a, which you'll remember is the front part of the quadratic formula. So if I plug in b and a, this becomes negative 4 over 2 times 2. In other words, negative 4 divided by 4, which is negative 1. And once I found that point, or more correctly, the x value of the point, it's easy to find the y value because the y value is the output. And all we need to do to find an output is plug in the input. So negative 1, we're going to plug back into the function equation. And that will tell us what k is. Make sure that you use parentheses at this step because it'll be really important to be careful with that negative right there. When I plug in for k, this is what it should look like. And following order of operations, I would square this first so that it becomes positive 1. And then after you deal with exponents, we multiply next. And this negative 4 means what we're really doing is subtracting. 2 minus 4, which is negative 2, minus 3 becomes negative 5. And that's my k value. So having found h and k, I now know what the vertex is. It's this point. I also know that this vertex is going to be a minimum. And the reason I know that is because the a value from the original equation is a positive number. So the parabola is going to look something like this. And we'll graph it for real in a minute. But by just sketching what it's going to look like, it's easy for me to remember that that's a minimum. Okay, so we've taken care of the vertex. But that's not all that we need. We also need to know about the roots. The roots is a little more complicated because there are multiple methods. In particular, the best way to find the roots would be to factor. But the problem is we can't always factor. And if we can't factor, we might have to use one of the other methods that we learned. Let's try factoring first since it is easiest. I notice that there's an a value out front, so factoring in my head probably won't be that easy. And I use the snowflake method to help me make sure that I can put this in factored form. Remember that factored form is where you have two sets of parentheses. When I fill in my snowflake, a times c at the top becomes negative 6, and 4 goes at the bottom. Unfortunately, now that I've set it up, I realize that there's no way to find two different numbers that will multiply to a negative 6 and still add to a positive 4. So unfortunately, Turns out we can't factor. That's okay, because I have a backup plan. My backup plan is the quadratic formula. Quadratic formula will always work. You probably remember that the quadratic formula looks like this. I like to encourage my Algebra 2 students not to plug in every single number on its own, but if you're going to go ahead and do this shortcut that I'm about to do, you need to be very careful with two particular things. First of all, this negative symbol right here, and then second of all, this one right there. That symbol might change depending on what A and C are, but we need to be really careful in calculating what it's going to be. I've already got A, B, and C up at the top. If you like, you could write them down here too, so that we plug in correctly. A is the coefficient of x squared, B is the coefficient of x, and C is the constant. When I plug into the quadratic formula, I get something that looks like this. Negative 4 times positive 2 is negative 8, times negative 3 is going to be positive 24. 2 times 2 on the bottom. Simplifying this can be a little bit of work, so just be really careful about the order in which you tackle it. I would like to usually do the square root symbol first. When we add inside, we get the square root of 40. And then I know that this isn't a perfect square, but I know that I can simplify it because I remember that 40 is the same thing as 4 times 10. And 4 is a perfect square. So even though I can't take the square root of 40, I can at least take the square root of 4, which means that I can rewrite this square root as 2 times the square root of 10. The 10 gets stuck inside. I'm going to keep bringing everything else down. And I'm actually at this point going to remind you that this 4 on the bottom is belonging both to the square root and to the b value. So you might want to write it in two pieces. It'll help you simplify the next step. Next, we know that negative 4 divided by 4 is just going to be negative 1. Keep writing this plus or minus. We'll explain what that's going to mean in just a second. And now 2 over 4 can be simplified because they're outside of the square root. Normally that would simplify to 1 over 2. In this case, I'm not going to write the 1. I'm going to leave it as the square root of 10 divided by 2. Now, this is pretty much done. However, I know that ultimately I really want to be graphing this, and this format isn't very useful because I don't really know what number this is. So in order to graph it, I'm actually going to convert this into a decimal. And more specifically, I'm going to convert it into 2 decimals because there's really 2 numbers here. This plus or minus means that one time we want to add these 2 things. And that'll give us the first root. And then I'm going to go ahead and subtract them, and that'll be the second root. I'm going to go ahead and use my phone to do this. Maybe you have something that looks similar. You need a scientific calculator like this one. And I'll try and get rid of the glare here. I'm not sure how well it's going to work, but putting this into my phone, I'm going to start with 10, and then I'll take the square root of that. I divide it by 2, and then, I think I did that wrong. Let me try that again here. 10 square root divided by 2. And then that's a negative, so I'm going to turn it into a negative, and I'm going to subtract the 1 from it, which gives me a root of negative 2.58, and that's my first root. For the second one, we follow almost the same steps, except that we're going to add. So I go back and take the square root of 10, and then divide it by 2. And this time, it's a positive root 10 over 2. I'm still going to subtract 1 because the 1's negative, though. So my second root is x equals 0.58. Please keep your decimals with 2 decimal places. Now, it looks like I have all the information I need. I've got the vertex, and I've got my 2 roots. The last thing I need to do is put these together so that they form a graph. And I'll do that over to the side here. So it's not going to be a perfect graph. That's okay. Mostly, I just want to make sure that these points get seen. So to start with, I know that my vertex is at -1, -5. -1 is going to be 1 to the left here, and then I'm going to go down 5. And I'll make my point. I know that's a minimum, so my parabola is going to go up. And I know that the roots are going to be on the x-axis. The first one's going to be at -2.58. So that'll be somewhere between -2 and -3. And you can just guess. The next one is going to be 0.58, so it'll be just across the line between 0 and 1. And now that I have these 3 key points, I'm going to go ahead and sketch a parabola that faces up. And this becomes my answer. For your final answer, please label the points so that I know exactly what they are, since they're not perfect points. And you can label them just the way you would write a 0, which is as a point with x first, and then y. The vertex we can also label. And the last thing we want to do is we want to write the range and the line of symmetry. The range, remember, describes the y's, and the y values for this function are above or equal to -5. For the line of symmetry, we again look at the vertex, and the line of symmetry goes straight through the graph. In this case, it's at x equals -1. Take a moment to look at this work. If you would like to read it again, you should pause the video here. Otherwise, I'll go on to show you the answers.